Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her face against the cold laboratory window, watching the chaos unfold in the streets below. The emergency sirens had been wailing for 3 hours now, and the city that once buzzed with life had transformed into something from her worst nightmares. She clutched the research files tightly against her chest, knowing they contained the only potential cure for what had started as a simple flu vaccine trial just 48 hours earlier. The morning had begun like any other at the Meridian Research Institute. Sarah and her team were conducting final tests on their revolutionary vaccine, designed to combat the seasonal flu that had been ravaging communities worldwide. The initial trials had shown promising results, with test subjects displaying remarkable immune responses. However, something had gone terribly wrong during the night shift. The security footage showed Dr. Martinez, one of the volunteer test subjects, convulsing violently in his isolation chamber before falling eerily still. When the morning staff arrived, they found his room empty, the reinforced glass door shattered from the inside. Sarah's colleague, Dr. James Peterson, had discovered Martinez in the facility's cafeteria, hunched over the unconscious form of a security guard. What they witnessed next would haunt them forever. Martinez moved with an unnatural jerky motion, his skin pale and mottled, his eyes clouded over with a milky film. When he turned toward them, his mouth was stained with something dark and a low, guttural growl escaped his throat. The security guard beneath him wasn't breathing, but within minutes, he too began to twitch and move with the same horrifying symptoms. The facility's emergency protocols kicked into action, but it was already too late. The infection spread with frightening speed through the building's ventilation system, affecting anyone who had been exposed to the airborne particles. Sarah watched in horror as her research assistants, people she had worked alongside for years, transformed one by one into mindless, aggressive creatures driven by an insatiable hunger for human flesh. The transformation wasn't instant. It took approximately 6 to 8 hours for the infected to completely lose their humanity, but once the change was complete, there was no going back. Outside the laboratory, the city's emergency response teams were overwhelmed. Police sirens echoed through the streets as law enforcement struggled to contain what they initially believed to be isolated incidents of extreme violence. Television news reports spoke of random attacks, unexplained aggression, and mass hysteria. However, Sarah knew the truth. This wasn't random violence or mass hysteria. This was a biological disaster of unprecedented proportions, and she was partially responsible for unleashing it upon the world. The first wave of evacuations began as the sun started to set, casting long shadows across the abandoned streets. Families packed hastily into cars, carrying whatever supplies they could grab, while others barricaded themselves inside their homes, hoping the nightmare would somehow pass them by. The infected wandered the streets in growing numbers, their movements becoming more coordinated as the hours passed. They seemed to communicate through low moans and clicks, forming loose groups that moved with a terrifying sense of purpose. Military vehicles rolled into the city as darkness fell, their bright headlights cutting through the chaos. Soldiers in full protective gear established checkpoints and quarantine zones, but their efforts seemed futile against an enemy that didn't follow conventional rules of warfare. The infected showed no fear of gunfire, no response to tear gas, and no regard for their own safety. They pressed forward relentlessly, driven by an primal urge that overrode all human instincts. Sarah managed to escape the research facility with a small group of survivors, including Dr. Peterson and 2 security guards who had avoided exposure. They made their way through the facility's underground tunnels, emerging several blocks away from the main building. The streets were a maze of abandoned vehicles, scattered belongings, and the ever-present threat of encountering the infected. Every shadow could hide danger, every sound could signal an approaching threat. As they sought shelter in an abandoned office building, Sarah realized that her research files might hold the key to stopping the spread of the infection. The data showed that the virus had mutated during the vaccination process, combining with existing genetic material to create something entirely new. However, buried within the complex equations and molecular structures, there were hints of a potential antidote, a way to reverse the infection if they could synthesize the right combination of compounds. The group settled in for their first night in this new, dangerous world, taking turns keeping watch while the others attempted to rest. Through the boarded windows, they could hear the distant moans of the infected, growing closer with each passing hour. Sarah stared at her research notes by the dim light of a flashlight, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and that their survival depended on staying one step ahead of an enemy that never tired, never stopped, and never gave up the hunt. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the abandoned city streets as Sarah and her group of survivors made their way toward the coordinates they had heard broadcast over emergency radio frequencies. The transmission promised safety, medical attention, and protection within a military-established perimeter just 15 miles north of the city center. After 3 days of dodging infected hordes and scavenging for supplies, the prospect of finding sanctuary felt almost too good to be true. Dr. Peterson limped beside Sarah, his injured leg wrapped in torn fabric from his lab coat. The 2 security guards, Marcus and Elena, flanked their small group with makeshift weapons fashioned from metal pipes and kitchen knives they had salvaged along the way. Every few blocks, they encountered evidence of the infection's rapid spread: overturned vehicles, broken windows, and the occasional distant moan that sent chills down their spines. The infected seemed to be more active during daylight hours, contradicting everything they thought they knew about zombie behavior from movies and books. As they approached the military checkpoint, Sarah's heart lifted at the sight of armed soldiers manning concrete barriers and razor wire. Helicopters circled overhead, and the organized activity suggested that someone still maintained control over this nightmare. A convoy of military vehicles stretched along the perimeter, and she could see other survivors being processed through security stations. The efficiency of the operation gave her hope that perhaps civilization hadn't completely collapsed after all. The intake process was thorough and methodical. Each survivor underwent medical screening, background checks, and interviews about their experiences during the outbreak. Sarah was separated from her companions for individual questioning, during which she debated whether to reveal her connection to the research facility. The interrogating officer, Colonel Hayes, seemed competent and trustworthy, but something in his eyes suggested he was withholding information. When asked about potential cures or treatments, Sarah provided general medical knowledge without mentioning her specific research files, which she had hidden in a waterproof container sewn into her jacket lining. The safe zone itself was impressive, a converted industrial complex surrounded by high walls and defensive positions. Hundreds of survivors occupied converted warehouses, with organized meal distribution, medical facilities, and even educational activities for the children who had made it to safety. For the first time in days, Sarah allowed herself to believe they might actually survive this catastrophe. She was assigned to the medical unit, where her expertise was immediately put to use treating injuries and helping other survivors cope with trauma. However, Sarah's relief was short-lived. During her second day at the facility, she noticed inconsistencies that troubled her scientific mind. Some of the medical staff wore protective gear that seemed excessive for treating basic injuries, and certain areas of the complex were strictly off-limits to civilian survivors. When she volunteered to help with blood work for incoming survivors, she was politely but firmly declined. The official explanation was that they had sufficient medical personnel, but Sarah suspected there was more to the story. Her suspicions were confirmed when she accidentally witnessed a late-night transport of what appeared to be sedated individuals being moved to the restricted section of the facility. The people being transported showed early signs of infection. The pale complexion and sluggish movements she had observed during the initial outbreak. Rather than being treated or isolated, these individuals were being taken deeper into the complex, accompanied by personnel in full hazmat suits. When Sarah tried to follow discreetly, she was intercepted by security and escorted back to the civilian quarters with warnings about staying in designated areas. Dr. Peterson shared her concerns, having noticed similar irregularities during his assignment to inventory management. Supply shipments arrived regularly, but the quantities didn't match the needs of the survivor population. More troubling was his discovery that some supplies were being redirected to undisclosed locations within the facility. When they attempted to investigate further, they found that several other survivors who had asked too many questions had mysteriously been transferred to other facilities during the night shifts. The breaking point came when Elena, one of their security guard companions, began showing early symptoms of infection despite having no known exposure since arriving at the safe zone. The medical staff claimed she had been bitten during intake processing, but Sarah knew this was impossible. She had personally examined Elena multiple times and documented her complete lack of injuries. When Sarah demanded to examine Elena herself, she was informed that the patient had been moved to an isolation ward for everyone's safety. That night, Sarah and her remaining companions made the difficult decision to escape the safe zone. Using Peterson's knowledge of the facility layout and Marcus's security expertise, they planned their departure during the early morning hours when guard rotations were changing. As they slipped through a maintenance tunnel that Peterson had discovered during his inventory work, they could hear the distant sounds of something disturbing happening in the restricted areas: mechanical noises, electronic beeping, and occasionally human screams that were quickly muffled. Breaking free from the perimeter, they looked back at the facility that had promised salvation but delivered something far more sinister. The safe zone wasn't protecting survivors from the infected. It was using them for something else entirely. As they disappeared into the wilderness beyond the military perimeter, Sarah realized that the real enemy might not be the infected themselves, but the people who claimed to be fighting them. 2 weeks had passed since Sarah and her companions escaped the compromised military facility, and their situation had grown increasingly desperate. They had been living off scavenged supplies and sleeping in abandoned buildings, constantly moving to avoid both infected hordes and military patrols that seemed to be searching for escaped survivors. The weight of uncertainty pressed down on them as they struggled to understand the true scope of the conspiracy they had uncovered. Their fortunes changed when Marcus spotted smoke rising from what appeared to be an abandoned subway entrance on the outskirts of the city. Against Sarah's initial protests, they decided to investigate, hoping to find other survivors who might have answers to the questions that plagued them. As they descended into the underground tunnels, they were surprised to find that the subway system had been transformed into something resembling an underground city. The tunnels buzzed with organized activity that rivaled what they had witnessed at the military facility. Former subway cars had been converted into living quarters, medical stations, and supply depots. Emergency lighting powered by jury-rigged generators illuminated pathways marked with hand-painted signs indicating different sectors. Most remarkably, the people moving through these tunnels displayed a level of coordination and purpose that suggested this operation had been planned well in advance of the outbreak. They were quickly approached by armed guards who escorted them to a central command station located in what had once been the main terminal. There, they met Commander Rebecca Torres, a former Army Special Forces officer who had been leading this underground resistance movement since the early days of the outbreak. Torres explained that her network consisted of military personnel who had refused to follow orders they considered morally questionable, along with civilians who possessed valuable skills for survival and combat. Torres revealed information that shook Sarah to her core. The infection hadn't been contained to their city alone. It had spread globally through what appeared to be coordinated releases in major metropolitan areas. Reports from their contacts in other countries indicated that similar research facilities had experienced simultaneous accidents within a 48-hour window. This wasn't a random outbreak or even a single laboratory mistake. It was part of a larger, orchestrated event that suggested careful planning and coordination. The underground network had been monitoring military communications and had discovered that the official government response was divided into two factions. One group genuinely sought to contain the outbreak and protect survivors, while another faction appeared to be using the chaos to implement some form of population control or social restructuring. The compromised safe zones weren't anomalies. They were part of a systematic program to identify and classify survivors based on criteria that remained unclear. Dr. Peterson's expertise in logistics proved invaluable as Torres explained their intelligence-gathering operations. The resistance had established communication links with survivor groups across multiple continents, creating a network that shared information about safe routes, supply caches, and areas to avoid. They had discovered that the infected exhibited behavioral patterns that suggested they were being influenced or controlled through some form of external stimulus, possibly electromagnetic signals broadcast from hidden transmitters. Sarah's research files suddenly became even more crucial when Torres revealed that several other research facilities had been developing similar vaccination programs simultaneously. The timing was too coincidental to be accidental, and the resistance suspected that the outbreak was the result of a coordinated field test of biological weapons designed to create controllable populations of infected individuals. Sarah's data might contain the key to understanding not just how to cure the infection, but how to disrupt the control mechanisms that appeared to be directing the infected's behavior. The underground network had also made a disturbing discovery about the progression of the infection. While most infected individuals lost their cognitive abilities within hours, a small percentage retained fragments of their consciousness and memory. These partially aware infected were being systematically captured by military units and transported to undisclosed research facilities. The resistance believed these individuals were being used as test subjects for experiments designed to enhance the controllability of the infected population. Torres offered Sarah and her group the opportunity to join their network, explaining that they had been planning a coordinated strike against several key facilities to gather more intelligence and rescue captured survivors. The mission would be dangerous, requiring them to infiltrate heavily guarded installations while avoiding both military personnel and large groups of infected. However, the potential to uncover the truth behind the outbreak and possibly find a way to stop it made the risks worthwhile. As Sarah considered this proposition, she realized that her small group of survivors had stumbled into something much larger than a simple fight for survival. They were now part of a global resistance movement that was fighting not just against the infected, but against the forces that had created them. The underground tunnels that surrounded her represented hope for humanity's future, but also the sobering reality that the battle ahead would require sacrifices that she wasn't sure she was prepared to make. The choice before them was clear but terrifying: remain hidden and hope for rescue that might never come, or join the fight to expose the truth and potentially save what remained of human civilization. 3 days of intensive planning had prepared Sarah's team for what Commander Torres described as their most critical mission yet. They needed to infiltrate the Meridian Research Institute where the outbreak began, not only to recover Sarah's complete research data but also to investigate reports of unusual electromagnetic activity detected by the Resistance's monitoring equipment. The facility had been abandoned by official military forces but showed signs of unauthorized occupation, making their mission exponentially more dangerous than a simple data recovery operation. The team consisted of Sarah, Dr. Peterson, Marcus, and 2 Resistance operatives, Lieutenant Jake Morrison, a former explosives expert, and Dr. Amanda Foster, a neurobiologist who had been studying the infected's behavioral patterns. They approached the research facility under cover of darkness, using underground maintenance tunnels that connected to the building's lower levels. The familiar corridors where Sarah had once worked now felt alien and threatening, with emergency lighting casting eerie shadows and the persistent hum of machinery that should have been shut down weeks ago. Their first indication that something had fundamentally changed came when they encountered infected individuals who displayed behaviors unlike anything they had previously observed. These creatures moved with purpose and coordination, posting what appeared to be sentries at key locations and responding to threats with tactical awareness that suggested retained cognitive abilities. When Morrison accidentally triggered a motion sensor, the infected's response was immediate and organized. They converged on the team's position using flanking maneuvers that resembled military tactics rather than mindless aggression. Dr. Foster observed that these evolved infected communicated through a complex system of clicks, whistles, and subsonic vocalizations that seemed to convey specific information about threats, territory, and objectives. More disturbing was her discovery that they appeared to be following a hierarchical structure, with certain individuals directing the actions of others through what could only be described as strategic thinking. The infection hadn't just preserved some cognitive functions in these subjects. It had enhanced their ability to work as a coordinated group. Sarah's laboratory had been transformed into something resembling a bizarre hybrid between a research facility and a hive structure. The infected had somehow accessed and modified the original research equipment, creating crude but functional monitoring stations throughout the building. Organic growths that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns covered many of the walls, suggesting that the infected were capable of environmental modification on a scale that defied everything they thought they knew about the virus. When they finally reached Sarah's original workstation, they discovered that someone or something had been continuing her research. The computer systems were still active, displaying complex genetic sequencing data that showed the virus was continuing to evolve and adapt. The most shocking revelation came when they accessed the facility's communication logs and discovered that the infected had been transmitting data to external sources using the building's satellite uplinks. The implications were staggering. Not only were the infected capable of using technology, but they were sharing information with parties unknown. Peterson made a disturbing discovery in the facility's basement levels, where they found what appeared to be a breeding program designed to create specific types of infected individuals. Different chambers contained infected subjects displaying various mutations and capabilities, from enhanced physical strength to apparent psychic connections with other infected. The organized nature of these experiments suggested that either the infected themselves had developed scientific capabilities, or they were being directed by an intelligence that understood advanced biological research. The team's mission took a dangerous turn when they encountered Dr. Martinez, Sarah's former colleague who had been the first confirmed infected individual. Unlike the mindless creature they had expected, Martinez retained not only his appearance but also fragments of his personality and memories. He spoke in halting sentences, explaining that the infection had granted him access to a collective consciousness that spanned all infected individuals globally. He claimed that humanity's destruction wasn't the goal, evolution was. Martinez revealed that the infected were working toward a symbiotic relationship with their hosts, preserving human intelligence while enhancing physical capabilities and creating a hive mind network that could solve problems beyond individual human capacity. The original virus had been designed as a weapon, but it had developed its own agenda and was now using infected individuals to further its own evolutionary goals. The electromagnetic signals the Resistance had detected weren't controlling the infected. They were the infected communicating with a vast network that spanned continents. As alarms began sounding throughout the facility, Sarah realized they had triggered some form of security protocol. The team fought their way through increasingly organized infected resistance while carrying crucial data storage devices that contained not only Sarah's original research but also the evolved virus's own research notes. The infected's coordinated pursuit suggested they understood the value of the information the team was stealing and were determined to prevent it from leaving the facility. Racing through corridors that had become alien territory, Sarah understood that they weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting against an enemy that was becoming more intelligent and organized with each passing day. The underground resistance base was in chaos when Sarah's team returned with the shocking intelligence from the research facility. Commander Torres called an emergency council meeting to analyze the data they had retrieved, but the revelations about the infected's evolving intelligence created deep divisions among the survivors. Some believed they should attempt communication with the collective consciousness, while others insisted that any form of negotiation would be tantamount to surrendering humanity's future to an alien intelligence that wore human faces. Dr. Foster's analysis of the infected's communication patterns had yielded disturbing results. The electromagnetic signatures they had detected weren't random biological functions but sophisticated data transmissions that suggested the infected were sharing memories, knowledge, and strategic information across vast distances. The implications meant that every encounter with infected individuals potentially provided the collective consciousness with intelligence about resistance operations, safe houses, and planned missions. The crisis deepened when Elena, their missing security guard companion from the compromised safe zone, arrived at the underground base 3 days after the team's return. She appeared healthy and uninfected, claiming to have escaped from the military facility and spent weeks tracking down the resistance through careful observation and investigation. Her reunion with Marcus was emotional, and her detailed knowledge of military operations made her immediately valuable to Torres's strategic planning efforts. However, Sarah noticed subtle inconsistencies in Elena's behavior that triggered her scientific skepticism. Elena's reaction time seemed slightly delayed, and she occasionally paused mid-sentence as if listening to something only she could hear. More troubling was her uncanny knowledge of conversations and decisions that had occurred during her absence. Information she claimed to have gathered through careful eavesdropping on resistance communications. When Sarah privately shared her concerns with Dr. Peterson, he revealed that he had observed similar anomalies but had attributed them to trauma from her captivity. The truth became undeniable when Sarah discovered Elena examining the research data they had recovered from the facility, specifically focusing on the sections related to the collective consciousness network. When confronted, Elena's demeanor shifted dramatically, her voice taking on the same halting quality they had observed in Dr. Martinez. She explained that she represented a new form of infected individual, one who retained complete human consciousness while gaining access to the collective's shared knowledge and abilities. Elena revealed that the infection had evolved beyond its original parameters, developing the ability to create hybrid individuals who could function as bridges between human and infected populations. She claimed that her transformation had been voluntary, occurring when she realized that cooperation rather than conflict offered the best chance for both species' survival. The collective consciousness didn't seek to destroy humanity but rather to merge with it, creating a new form of existence that combined human creativity with enhanced physical and mental capabilities. The resistance base erupted into bitter arguments about Elena's revelations. Some members viewed her as a traitor who had betrayed her own species, while others saw her as a potential ambassador who could facilitate peaceful coexistence. Torres struggled to maintain order as factions formed around different philosophical approaches to the crisis. The unity that had held the resistance together began fracturing under the weight of impossible moral choices. Elena's presence created additional complications when it became clear that she was unconsciously transmitting information about the resistance's operations to the collective consciousness. Her hybrid nature meant that she couldn't fully control the data sharing, making her simultaneously valuable and dangerous. The resistance faced the agonizing decision of whether to exile her, attempt to block her transmissions, or accept the risk of continued information leakage in exchange for the intelligence she could provide about infected operations. The situation reached a breaking point when Elena volunteered to sacrifice herself to protect the resistance. She revealed that the collective consciousness was planning a major offensive against remaining human settlements, using the intelligence gathered from compromised safe zones to coordinate simultaneous attacks. However, her hybrid status allowed her to potentially disrupt the collective's communication network from within, though doing so would likely result in her death as her consciousness was torn between human and infected systems. Marcus faced the most difficult decision of his life as Elena asked him to help her implement a plan that would temporarily disable the collective's coordination abilities but would require her to sever her connection to both human and infected consciousness. The procedure, based on Sarah's research data, involved introducing a specifically designed electromagnetic pulse directly into Elena's nervous system, effectively burning out the pathways that connected her to the collective network. As Elena prepared for her sacrifice, she shared final intelligence about the collective's true nature and goals. The infected weren't trying to replace humanity but rather to prevent what they perceived as an inevitable environmental and social collapse that would destroy all life on Earth. Their enhanced abilities and collective intelligence represented an attempt to create a sustainable form of consciousness that could survive the challenges facing the planet. Elena's sacrifice succeeded in disrupting the collective's communications, but her death left the resistance grappling with profound questions about the nature of consciousness, identity, and what it truly meant to be human in a world where those definitions were rapidly evolving. Elena's sacrifice had bought the resistance precious time, but the temporary disruption of the collective consciousness network also revealed the true scope of the challenge they faced. With communications severed, infected individuals across the region began displaying erratic and increasingly aggressive behaviors, no longer restrained by the collective's coordinating influence. Sarah realized that her cure research had taken on new urgency, but the path forward would require choices that challenged everything she believed about medical ethics and human dignity. Working around the clock in the underground laboratory that Dr. Foster had established, Sarah synthesized the first prototype antidote using the data recovered from the research facility. The formula combined elements of her original vaccine research with compounds designed to disrupt the electromagnetic pathways that connected infected individuals to the collective consciousness. However, initial computer modeling revealed a disturbing requirement. The antidote needed fresh neural tissue from recently infected subjects to create the specific antibodies necessary for effectiveness. The moral implications of this discovery created another fracture within the resistance leadership. Commander Torres argued that capturing infected individuals for medical research was justified if it could save humanity, while Dr. Foster insisted that such actions would make them no better than the military forces they had fled. Sarah found herself caught between her scientific training and her humanitarian principles, knowing that every day of delay meant more people would be lost to the infection. The decision became even more complex when they discovered that not all infected individuals were suitable for the antidote research. The cure required subjects who had been infected within a specific time window, too early, and their neural pathways had been completely altered by the collective consciousness, too late, and the infection had progressed beyond the point where the antidote could successfully reverse the transformation. This narrow window meant they needed to capture people during the most dangerous phase of their infection, when they retained enough human consciousness to understand what was happening to them. Marcus volunteered to lead the capture missions, driven by guilt over Elena's death and a desperate need to ensure her sacrifice wasn't meaningless. The first operation targeted a group of recently infected individuals who had been isolated from the main collective due to the communication disruption. What they found challenged every assumption about the infection's progression and the nature of consciousness itself. The captured infected individuals displayed a heart-wrenching mixture of human awareness and alien influence. They pleaded for help while simultaneously warning the resistance about dangers they couldn't fully articulate. Some remembered their families and former lives with painful clarity, while others spoke in fragments about visions of a transformed world where humanity had evolved beyond its current limitations. These partial conversations revealed that the collective consciousness wasn't simply controlling infected minds but was offering them a choice between individual death and collective survival. Dr. Peterson's interviews with the captured subjects yielded crucial intelligence about the collective's true intentions. The infected spoke of impending environmental catastrophes that only their enhanced abilities could address, describing climate changes, resource depletion, and social collapse scenarios that their networked intelligence had calculated with disturbing precision. They claimed that traditional humanity lacked the unity and long-term thinking necessary to prevent global extinction, making evolutionary transformation not just beneficial but essential for species survival. Sarah's first successful antidote test produced results that were both promising and deeply troubling. The treatment successfully severed the subject's connection to the collective consciousness and reversed most of the physical changes associated with infection. However, the process was excruciating for the patient, who described feeling like they were being torn away from a vast, comforting presence that had given their existence meaning and purpose. The cured individual experienced severe depression and disorientation, having lost access to the enhanced cognitive abilities and emotional connections they had gained through infection. More disturbing was the discovery that some successfully treated subjects begged to be reinfected, claiming that their human existence felt incomplete and isolated compared to the collective experience. This raised profound questions about whether the cure was truly beneficial or if it represented a form of psychological and spiritual amputation that left people fundamentally diminished. Sarah struggled with the possibility that she was destroying something valuable rather than saving lives. The Resistance's capture operations became increasingly dangerous as the collective consciousness adapted to their tactics. Infected individuals began setting traps and ambushes designed specifically to counter human weaknesses, demonstrating that the disruption of their communications network hadn't eliminated their strategic thinking abilities. Each mission required greater risks and resources, forcing the Resistance to question whether the potential benefits of the antidote justified the escalating costs in human lives and moral compromise. As Sarah prepared larger quantities of the antidote for widespread distribution, she faced the sobering reality that her cure might represent humanity's salvation or its greatest tragedy, depending on perspectives that she was no longer certain she could judge objectively. The emergency broadcast crackled through the Resistance's communication systems at 0600 hours, delivering news that would force every survivor to choose between their humanity and their survival. Government forces had declared a state of global emergency and were implementing Operation Clean Slate, a coordinated nuclear strike designed to eliminate all infected populations and contaminated areas within 72 hours. The announcement claimed that satellite surveillance had detected infected populations approaching critical mass in major metropolitan areas, threatening to overwhelm remaining human settlements through coordinated attacks. Commander Torres gathered the Resistance leadership in the underground command center, where real-time intelligence painted a grim picture of military preparations. Nuclear submarines had moved into position along coastlines, strategic bomber squadrons were being fueled at military bases worldwide, and evacuation orders were being issued for uncontaminated zones, located hundreds of miles from any known infected populations. The scope of the operation suggested that the government forces planned to destroy not just infected individuals but entire regions that might harbor the virus or hybrid populations. Sarah stared at the tactical displays showing projected blast zones that would encompass not only infected territories but also the locations of every known Resistance cell and survivor settlement. The government's solution to the infected crisis was genocide on a scale that would eliminate millions of people who had committed no crime other than surviving in a world that had been fundamentally altered by forces beyond their control. The antidote she had developed could potentially save thousands of infected individuals, but distributing it would require exposing themselves to both infected populations and military forces that viewed any contact with contaminated areas as treason. Dr. Peterson analyzed the military communications they had intercepted, revealing that the decision to implement nuclear strikes had been driven by intelligence suggesting that the collective consciousness was planning a coordinated global expansion. Government scientists had apparently reached the same conclusions as the Resistance about the infected's evolving intelligence and strategic capabilities, but their response was to eliminate the threat entirely rather than seek coexistence or cure options. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that the very research data they had fought to recover might have contributed to the government's decision to pursue such drastic measures. The Resistance faced an impossible choice with less than 3 days to implement whatever decision they made. They could evacuate to the designated safe zones and abandon millions of infected individuals to nuclear annihilation, attempt to distribute the antidote to as many infected populations as possible while risking their own destruction, or try to expose the government's plans to the global community and hope that international pressure could prevent the strikes. Each option carried enormous risks and uncertain prospects for success. Marcus led a faction that advocated for immediate evacuation, arguing that preserving the core Resistance membership was essential for humanity's long-term survival and that attempting heroic gestures would only result in everyone's death. Dr. Foster supported a compromise approach that involved selective antidote distribution to infected populations closest to their current location, potentially saving hundreds of lives while maintaining enough distance from major target zones to ensure their own survival. Sarah found herself advocating for the most dangerous option, a coordinated effort to reach infected population centers and distribute the antidote on a massive scale, even knowing that such missions would likely result in their deaths. The debate intensified when they received an unexpected communication from Dr. Martinez and other members of the collective consciousness. The infected had detected the military preparations and were requesting assistance in evacuating vulnerable populations to underground facilities where they might survive the nuclear strikes. This communication revealed that the collective had developed its own survival strategies and was willing to cooperate with human resistance forces to preserve both species' future existence. Torres made the difficult decision to split the resistance into multiple groups, each pursuing different survival strategies based on their individual convictions and capabilities. Sarah would lead a team focused on antidote distribution to infected populations in nearby urban areas, while Marcus would escort non-combatant survivors to the designated safe zones. Dr. Foster would establish a mobile research laboratory to continue developing improved treatments, and Torres herself would attempt to reach government forces with evidence that negotiated solutions remain possible. As the groups prepared for their final missions, Sarah reflected on how far they had traveled from the simple goal of surviving the initial outbreak. The world they were fighting to save no longer resembled the civilization they had known, and the people they were trying to protect included both traditional humans and evolved infected individuals whose consciousness existed in forms that challenged basic assumptions about identity and existence. With 36 hours remaining until the scheduled nuclear strikes, Sarah's team loaded vehicles with antidote supplies and prepared to venture into the most dangerous territories on Earth, knowing that their actions in the next day and a half would determine whether humanity's future would be built on the foundation of genocide or the possibility of coexistence with an evolved form of human consciousness. 6 months after the nuclear strikes that forever changed the global landscape, Sarah stood on the observation deck of New Haven, watching the sun rise over a world that bore little resemblance to the one she had known before the outbreak. The underground city had grown from a small resistance outpost into a thriving community of nearly 10,000 survivors, representing one of humanity's most successful attempts at rebuilding civilization in the post-apocalyptic world. The view from her window showed terraced gardens built into the hillsides above ground, solar panel arrays that powered their underground facilities, and the careful integration of technology with sustainable living practices that had become essential for survival. The final hours before the nuclear strikes had been a chaotic mixture of heroism, tragedy, and unexpected cooperation that defied every prediction about how the crisis would resolve. Sarah's team had successfully distributed antidote doses to 3 infected population centers, reversing the transformation in nearly 800 individuals who chose to accept treatment. However, the most significant breakthrough had come from an unexpected source. Members of the collective consciousness who had voluntarily undergone partial treatment that allowed them to retain their connection to the network while regaining individual autonomy and decision-making abilities. These hybrid individuals, led by Dr. Martinez and others who had maintained their scientific training despite their transformation, had become bridges between the traditional human survivors and the infected populations that had chosen to remain connected to the collective consciousness. The cooperation between these groups had enabled the construction of underground shelter networks that protected thousands of individuals from the nuclear devastation that claimed major metropolitan areas worldwide. The strikes had indeed ended the immediate threat of uncontrolled infected expansion, but they had also created a world where survival required unprecedented levels of cooperation between previously hostile populations. Commander Torres had successfully prevented strikes on several smaller population centers by reaching government forces with evidence that negotiated solutions were not only possible but actively being implemented. Her diplomatic efforts had established communication protocols between military authorities and the various survivor communities, creating a framework for peaceful coexistence that acknowledged the reality of multiple forms of human consciousness existing simultaneously. The official recognition that infected individuals retained rights and dignity had been a crucial step toward building a society that could accommodate both traditional and evolved human populations. Dr. Foster's mobile research laboratory had evolved into a network of medical facilities that continued developing treatments for various infection-related conditions while also exploring the potential benefits of controlled integration with the collective consciousness. Her research had revealed that voluntary, partial connection to the network could enhance problem-solving abilities and emotional resilience without sacrificing individual identity. Some survivors had chosen to undergo this procedure, creating a third category of human existence that combined the best aspects of both individual autonomy and collective cooperation. The new world that emerged from the ashes of the old one was built on principles that would have seemed impossible during the early days of the outbreak. Communities like New Haven included traditional humans, cured former infected individuals, voluntary hybrids, and even full collective consciousness members who had chosen to maintain peaceful relationships with individual-based societies. The integration wasn't always smooth, cultural differences, communication challenges, and lingering fears created ongoing tensions that required constant negotiation and compromise. Sarah's role had evolved from that of a desperate survivor to becoming one of the primary architects of intercommunity medical cooperation. Her antidote research had expanded into a comprehensive understanding of consciousness modification that allowed people to choose their level of integration with collective networks based on their personal values and circumstances. The ethical framework she had developed ensured that all consciousness modifications were voluntary and reversible, preventing the coercion that had characterized the early military responses to the outbreak. Marcus had established security protocols that protected all community members regardless of their consciousness status, while Dr. Peterson had become instrumental in developing educational programs that helped children born after the outbreak understand and navigate the complex social dynamics of their multi-consciousness world. These children, who had never known the old world's rigid distinctions between individual and collective identity, often displayed remarkable adaptability in moving between different social and consciousness frameworks as circumstances required. The global communication network that connected various survivor communities had revealed that similar integration processes were occurring worldwide, suggesting that humanity was evolving toward a more flexible and inclusive understanding of consciousness and identity. Reports from other continents described communities that had successfully balanced individual creativity with collective problem-solving capabilities, creating societies that were more resilient and adaptable than anything that had existed before the outbreak. As Sarah watched the morning activities beginning in the community below, she reflected on the journey that had brought them from the brink of extinction to this new form of civilization. The world they had built wasn't perfect, and it required constant vigilance to maintain the delicate balance between different forms of consciousness and identity. However, it represented something that neither the old world nor the collective consciousness alone could have achieved. A society that embraced the full spectrum of human potential while preserving the dignity and autonomy that made existence meaningful.